There is a very specific, deeply suffocating kind of tyranny that exists only within the manicured, eerily quiet borders of the modern American suburb, a tyranny not enforced by men with guns or tanks, but by pale, unremarkable bureaucrats wielding clipboards, color swatch catalogs, and an absolutely terrifying amount of unilateral authority over the microscopic details of your personal existence. I am not a man who asks for much from this world, having worked my entire adult life to provide a safe, quiet haven for my wife and our modest accumulation of earthly possessions. But when you spend a small fortune on a piece of land, paying your taxes and cutting your grass with religious devotion, you possess this naive, inherently American delusion that the dirt beneath your boots actually belongs to you. I learned exactly how false that assumption was when I crossed paths with Reginald T. Vance, the seemingly omnipotent director of urban aesthetics and compliance for the township of Oak Park, Illinois, a man who, I am firmly convinced, would measure the precise angle of a dog's tail wag to ensure it complied with the neighborhood's established historical character. My collision course with local government overreach began with an agonizingly simple, profoundly innocent desire to construct a tiny, 120-square-foot wooden sanctuary in my backyard, a simple garden shed meant to house nothing more sinister than a push mower, a couple of rusted rakes, and a mountain of tangled Christmas lights that my wife begged me to get out of the hallway. The urgency of this shed was born of pure family survival and domestic peace, primarily because my garage was currently serving as the sacred, climate-controlled sanctuary for my custom-built PC gaming rig, a beautiful, meticulously assembled beast housing an i5-12400 processor and an RTX 3060 graphics card that I was painstakingly tweaking for maximum frame rates in the quiet hours of the night, sitting right alongside my prized, perfectly tensioned Yonex Astrox badminton racket that I absolutely refused to subject to the warping, brutal humidity of the Midwestern outdoors. I just needed a wooden box to put the dirty things in so the clean things could stay safe. So I spent an entire, soul-crushing weekend navigating a labyrinth of municipal paperwork, providing them with architectural elevations, expected ambient light pollution metrics, and paint samples, treating this glorified plywood closet with the kind of reverent, bureaucratic deference usually reserved for the construction of a pediatric oncology wing. When the rejection letter arrived, delivered in a heavy, cream-colored envelope that practically reeked of elitist disdain, it was signed by Reginald T. Vance himself, categorically denying my permit on the grounds that my humble little shed would severely disrupt the historical sight lines and established pastoral heritage of the subdivision. A justification so breathtakingly absurd it actually made my vision blur with red-hot rage, considering that my backyard directly borders a 24-hour Taco Bell located right off the deafening asphalt of Route 66. The real, venomous sting of the rejection, however, was buried in a highlighted subsection of the local ordinances, decreeing that any detached structure must sit at least 20 feet from all property lines, a mathematical impossibility for my specific parcel of land, as the only viable, flat patch of grass was exactly 11 feet from my neighbor's chain-link fence, leaving me utterly trapped by a zoning map that viewed my life strictly in flat, two-dimensional constraints. I remember walking out into the oppressive afternoon heat, staring down at the perfectly innocent patch of green grass where my shed was supposed to sit, feeling the weight of a system designed to crush the spirit of the average homeowner, and feeling a profound, dangerous kind of spite taking root deep within my chest, a dark, pulsing realization that if they would not allow me to build upward into the sky that belonged to them, I would simply vanish downward into the earth that belonged to God. I didn't just want a place to put my mower anymore. I wanted bloody, bureaucratic vengeance, deciding right then and there, standing among the dandelions, that I was going to carve a hole into the crust of the earth so massive, so flagrantly disrespectful, and so utterly beyond the scope of their petty little rulebooks that Reginald T. Vance would need an entirely new category of zoning laws just to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. The very next morning, armed with nothing but a blinding sense of righteous fury and a ridiculously inadequate, shiny aluminum gardening trowel that looked like it was meant for repotting delicate indoor ferns, I began to literally scrape away at the foundation of the township's authority, digging a pathetic, kidney bean-shaped divot into the topsoil, sweating profusely as the crushing reality of excavating cubic yards of earth by hand began to set in. It was in this moment of sweaty, vulnerable exhaustion that I heard the sharp, judging intake of breath from over the fence, looking up to see the visor-wearing, eternally suspicious face of Martha Higgins, the self-appointed block captain of Elmwood Estates, a woman who treats the Neighborhood Watch program like a covert military operation and who immediately demanded to know what on earth I was ruining my lawn for. Thinking entirely on my feet, driven by the sheer adrenaline of my covert rebellion, I leaned on my tiny trowel and spun a web of absolute, scientific-sounding nonsense, telling her with a completely straight, solemn face that I was initiating a highly volatile, experimental deep soil hydrostatic anaerobic composting initiative, emphasizing that I needed to reach a depth of at least 25 feet to access the correct geological strata for the fungal spores to properly germinate, watching with deep, internal satisfaction as her jaw dropped in utter, uncomprehending bewilderment. When she finally scurried away to undoubtedly alert the neighborhood Facebook group about my impending toxic waste dump, I realized that my bluff had officially backed me into a corner, meaning I could no longer just dig a small hole, but instead, I was now spiritually obligated to hollow out the entire footprint of my yard, scaling my original 120-square-foot dream into a sprawling, 2,000-square-foot, multi-level subterranean fortress of pure, unadulterated defiance. Knowing that a gardening trowel was not going to defeat the municipal government, I retreated to my office and began scouring the dark corners of the internet for the kind of men who operate heavy, earth-moving machinery with a strictly cash-based, look-the-other-way mentality, eventually finding my salvation in a man named Mac, the owner of Cook County Excavation, a towering, gruff individual who showed up in a battered, diesel-belching pickup truck and possessed the weary eyes of a man who had seen far too many bodies buried to care about a zoning dispute. When I stood in my yard and outlined my completely unhinged vision to him, explaining that I needed a 25-foot deep crater spanning the entire usable acreage of my property for what I was vaguely calling a personal acoustic isolation chamber and emergency readiness facility, he simply stared at me, chewing on a toothpick, before grunting that it was going to cost me $45,000 in untraceable cash just to break ground, completely wiping out the savings account I had, painstakingly built to replace our aging roof. But at that moment, keeping the rain out of my living room felt entirely secondary to making a mockery of the Oak Park aesthetic guidelines. When Monday arrived, it brought with it the kind of ear-shattering, earth-trembling chaos that absolutely shattered the quiet serenity of Elmwood Estates, as Mac unleashed a massive, roaring yellow excavator onto my fragile turf, ripping through the topsoil and tearing deep into the clay, rapidly accumulating a towering, magnificent pile of displaced dirt on my driveway that I lovingly dubbed Mount Arthur, a temporary monument to my escalating madness that drove Martha Higgins into a state of near apoplectic rage as she paced her property line taking furious, shaky photographs. Once the crater was fully excavated, looking less like a construction site and more like the impact zone of a small meteor, I brought in the heavy reinforcements, hiring a meticulously organized, highly skeptical contractor named Sal from Titanium Pours Incorporated to handle the concrete, a man who constantly questioned why a suburban father needed 18-inch thick, steel rebar-reinforced monolithic poured walls, to which I simply replied, with a deadpan stare, that the radiation from the nearby Taco Bell fryers was a growing concern and I required military-grade blast resistance for my media storage. We were deep into the construction, the massive mixer trucks pouring thousands of pounds of gray liquid stone into the earth, when the entire operation nearly imploded into a catastrophic, jail-time-inducing nightmare. During the boring phase for the primary subterranean air intake shaft, Mac's crew accidentally clipped the main municipal water line feeding the entire block, causing a terrifying drop in pressure that I knew would instantly summon the city's utility inspectors. Panic seizing my throat. Realizing that all my covert planning was about to be exposed, I threw on a neon high-visibility vest, sprinted out into the street where my confused neighbors were already starting to gather, and loudly, confidently lied through my teeth, shouting over the rumble of the idling trucks that the city was conducting an unannounced, emergency pressure testing protocol on the infrastructure, and that everything was perfectly normal, managing to disperse the crowd just long enough for Mac to illegally patch the main line under the cover of darkness for an extra $5,000, fully transforming me from a frustrated homeowner into an active saboteur of municipal utilities. The illusion, however, was violently shattered just a few days later when I walked out to my mailbox and found a massive, aggressively red and white laminated sign bolted deeply into the earth, a formal, heart-stopping notice of unpermitted subsurface construction and immediate stop work order, bearing the arrogant, unmistakable signature of Reginald T. Vance. An act of bureaucratic aggression that I immediately countered by taking a can of black spray paint and casually writing "Future Home of the Underground Oasis, Inquire Within" directly across his official legal threat. The very next morning, the situation escalated from a turf war to a full-blown standoff when a convoy of official city vehicles pulled up to my curb, discharging a stern-faced Officer Jenkins of the local police department, alongside a severely dressed city inspector named Inspector Miller, and the main villain himself, Reginald, who looked absolutely trembling with bureaucratic outrage as they demanded immediate access to inspect the illegal, multi-level monstrosity I had hidden beneath the grass. Standing on my front porch, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my voice cold and steady, I categorically denied them entry without a warrant, watching with immense satisfaction as Reginald sputtered about structural violations and retaliation, entirely unaware that I had spent the previous 72 hours burning the midnight oil with a slick, aggressively fast-talking attorney named Leo from downtown Chicago, digging through the most archaic, forgotten footnotes of the township's building codes until we found the ultimate, golden loophole. When they threatened to condemn the property, Leo stepped out from the shadows of my hallway, adjusting his tie, and calmly handed them a freshly filed, legally binding declaration classifying my 2,000-square-foot, blast-proof bunker not as a habitable structure, but strictly as a seasonal sub-zero root cellar and agricultural storage unit. A bizarre, outdated classification from the 1800s that explicitly exempted subterranean food storage spaces below a certain ceiling height from requiring a formal building permit, completely paralyzing the city officials in their tracks. The city of Oak Park, utterly terrified of a highly public, deeply embarrassing lawsuit that would expose the fragile, contradictory nature of their own beloved zoning laws, was forced into a bitter, grinding retreat, settling the entire ordeal by slapping me with a massive, painful $20,000 fine for failing to file a preliminary excavation notice, a sum that bled my accounts completely dry, but which I paid with a wide, feral grin, knowing that buying the legal right to exist beneath their feet was worth every single penny. With the city officially neutralized and the structure legally protected as a glorified potato locker, the real work began as I poured the last of my credit limits into finishing the interior, transforming the upper level into a glowing, neon-drenched 1980s retro arcade, fully equipped with vintage pinball machines and a custom bar rated to withstand a 7.0 magnitude earthquake, while the cavernous lower level became a plush, soundproofed cinematic screening room, complete with luxury seating, and an impossibly large storage bay that echoed with the sheer volume of its own emptiness. To truly cement my victory and rub the salt deeply into the wounds of the Homeowners Association, I printed out dozens of high-quality invitations and blanketed the neighborhood, inviting everyone to the grand opening of my legally compliant agricultural storage facility, a party that drew a massive, bewildered crowd, including a deeply skeptical Martha Higgins, who descended the hidden spiral staircase cut into the sod with a look of profound, judgmental horror, trying desperately to find code violations amidst the flashing lights of the Pac-Man machines, while I happily informed her that the arcade cabinets were strictly necessary for maintaining the ambient humidity required for long-term root vegetable preservation. The evening reached a terrifying, cinematic climax around 11 o'clock when a rogue branch from the oak tree outside was sucked into the primary air intake shaft, causing the heavy ventilation fans to scream in protest before tripping the main breakers, plunging the entire underground complex into a sudden, suffocating darkness that sent the slightly intoxicated crowd into an absolute, primal panic. convinced that the world above them had actually ended in a nuclear firestorm, resulting in a chaotic, screaming stampede up the spiral stairs. As the steel blast door was thrown violently open to the cool night air, the terrified partygoers spilled out onto the lawn right into the utterly confused beams of flashlights held by Officer Jenkins and his partner Officer Kowalski, who had been dispatched for a noise complaint, only to find themselves staring down into a glowing, concrete abyss filled with panicked suburbanites, shaking their heads in total disbelief as I casually strolled up from the depths, offering them a tour of my perfectly legal root cellar and a chance to beat my high score on Galaga, an offer they quickly declined before driving away into the night, officially marking the end of the Great Zoning War. I had sacrificed my savings, my peace of mind, and my standing in the community, building an indestructible monument to my own stubbornness that I now primarily used just to play video games at deafening volumes without waking my wife, completely insulated from the complaining emails of my neighbors, sitting in my fortress of solitude and reveling in the quiet hum of the air filtration system. Yet, the ultimate, deeply embarrassing irony of this entire, exhausting saga, the punchline to a joke that cost me over $100,000, lies in the massive, climate-controlled, blast-proof storage room on the bottom floor, a room large enough to comfortably park a fleet of vehicles, where, sitting alone in the dead center of the pristine concrete floor, is a single, solitary garden rake, while outside, shivering in the damp, unforgiving Midwestern rain, sits the exact same rusty push mower that started this whole war, still trapped beneath a tearing plastic tarp exactly where the original shed was supposed to be built. I built an underground mansion to prove a point to a man with a clipboard, moving heaven and earth just to spite the system, and I still couldn't bring myself to carry that heavy damn mower down 2 flights of spiral stairs, leaving it up there as a permanent middle finger to Reginald T. Vance and his precious historical sightlines, proving that sometimes true justice isn't about solving your original problem, but about creating a new reality where their rules simply no longer apply. As I sit here in the quiet dark of my bunker, I have to ask, at what point does the protection of a neighborhood's character cross the line into the theft of a man's basic right to govern his own land? And when the law becomes nothing more than a weapon for the petty and the powerful, is malicious compliance our only remaining moral imperative?
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.